At the height of the Belle Époque, Gladys Deacon captivated the cultural elite with a rare combination of breathtaking beauty and sharp intellect. She was irresistible not just to high society, but to some of the greatest minds of her time. Her life is a stark reminder that even when you're the most beautiful woman in Europe, courted by literary giants and immortalized by legendary artists, a single moment of vanity can unravel everything, turning a celebrated socialite into a tragic figure who dies alone and forgotten in a mental institution. Marcel Proust wrote love letters praising her beauty. Auguste Rodin sculpted tributes to her form, and for 15 years she masterminded the most calculated romantic pursuit in aristocratic history, to marry a duke. But one ill-fated cosmetic procedure marked the beginning of a decades-long spiral, from palace walls to padded cell, proving that beauty and brilliance offer no protection against obsession or mental illness. Gladys Deacon's life is the ultimate cautionary tale, a haunting portrait of how childhood trauma, perfectionism and vanity can dismantle even the most dazzling destinies. In today's episode of Old Money Allure, we explore the rise and tragic fall of a woman who once had everything and lost it all. Some people are born into scandal, but Gladys Marie Deacon had the misfortune of having scandal literally explode around her childhood in the most dramatic way possible. Born on February 7, 1881 in Paris to wealthy American expatriates Edward Parker Deacon and Florence Baldwin, Gladys seemed destined for a life of privileged normalcy among the fashionable American community in Belle Époque France. Her father was a prosperous Boston textile manufacturer, while her mother was the daughter of Admiral Charles H. Baldwin, exactly the kind of respectable American aristocracy that dominated the expat social scene. For the first 11 years of her life, Gladys lived the charmed existence of a wealthy American child abroad, moving in the highest social circles and receiving the finest education money could provide. But on February 19th, 1892, her childhood innocence was shattered forever when her father committed one of the most sensational crimes in European high society history. Edward Parker Deacon had discovered that his wife Florence was conducting a passionate affair with a French lover named Émile Abeille, and his response was both swift and deadly. Armed with a revolver and consumed by rage, Edward broke down the door of Florence's apartments at the prestigious Hôtel Splendide in Cannes, where he found the cowering Frenchman attempting to hide behind a sofa. Without hesitation, Edward fired 3 shots from his revolver, killing Abeille instantly and creating a scandal that would dominate European newspapers for months. The murder sent shockwaves through the international social community, where the Deacons had been considered a model American family living the sophisticated European dream. Edward was immediately arrested and charged with murder, though his wealth and connections eventually allowed him to have the charge reduced to manslaughter and serve less than 4 months in prison. The scandal completely destroyed the Deacon family's reputation and left 11-year-old Gladys traumatized by witnessing the violent end of her parents' marriage and the public humiliation that followed. Following the murder trial, Gladys's parents divorced in 1893, with custody initially awarded to Edward despite his recent conviction for killing a man. However, Florence kidnapped Gladys from the Convent de l'Assomption in Auteuil, where she had been placed during Edward's imprisonment, triggering a bitter custody battle. Edward took Gladys and her sisters to the United States in 1893, settling in Newport, Rhode Island, where Gladys received an excellent education and was tutored in 7 languages. Despite her exceptional intelligence, one tutor described her as a brain genius, the trauma of her father's crime continued to haunt the family as Edward's mental health deteriorated rapidly. By 1899, Edward's psychological condition had become so unstable that he was committed to McLean Hospital for the Insane in Massachusetts, where he died in 1901. The institutionalization and death of her father left a profound impact on Gladys, who would spend the rest of her life terrified of inheriting his mental instability, a fear that would prove tragically prophetic. But first, she would use her beauty and intelligence to conquer Europe in ways that would make her the most celebrated woman of her generation, before vanity and obsession destroyed everything she had built. Returning to Europe as a wealthy orphan with a scandalous past, Gladys was about to prove that beauty combined with tragedy creates an irresistible cocktail for those seeking to dominate high society. Her combination of exceptional intelligence, stunning looks, and tragic backstory made her absolutely irresistible to the cultural elite of Paris, London, and Rome during the height of the Belle Époque. Gladys possessed what contemporaries described as radiant beauty, with striking blue-green eyes that would become her most famous feature and the subject of countless artistic tributes. Marcel Proust, the literary giant of the age, was completely enchanted by her, writing with obvious infatuation, "I never saw a girl with such beauty, such magnificent intelligence, such goodness and charm." The renowned art critic Bernard Berenson became so enamoured with Gladys that he seriously considered marrying her, while his wife Mary recorded her complex impressions. Beautiful, cruel, selfish, untrained. What will become of her? Gladys became the ultimate artist's muse, earning the distinction of being considered the most painted woman of her time by posing for some of Europe's greatest creators. The famous portraitist Giovanni Baldini created several stunning portraits of her, including a celebrated 1908 painting now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The sculptor Jacob Epstein created a magnificent bust of her in 1917, now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, while Auguste Rodin presented her with one of his works as a token of his admiration. Her social circle included some of the most influential figures of the era, and she was courted by various dukes and princes, including the Crown Prince of Prussia, who gave her a ring that Kaiser Wilhelm II later demanded be returned. But at the height of her beauty and social success, Gladys made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life and ultimately destroy everything she had worked to achieve. In 1903, at age 22, she became obsessed with what she perceived as a minor imperfection in her appearance, a slight indentation between the bridge of her nose and her forehead. Despite being universally acclaimed for her beauty, Gladys spent hours studying the proportions of classical Greek statues in Roman museums, measuring the distances between eyes and noses to understand the parameters of perfect faces. Inspired by the classical proportions she had studied obsessively, Gladys decided to undergo a primitive cosmetic procedure involving the injection of paraffin wax into her nose to create what she believed would be the perfect Greek profile. The goal was to form a straight line from her forehead to the tip of her nose, achieving the classical ideal that had consumed her thoughts and dominated her self-image. The paraffin wax injection, performed when plastic surgery was in its absolute infancy, proved to be a catastrophic mistake that would destroy her life. The wax, which was supposed to remain permanently in place, began to migrate and melt over time, gradually moving from its original position and creating increasingly distorted facial features. What had been intended to enhance her legendary beauty instead transformed her into a grotesque caricature of her former self, as the migrating wax eventually settled in her jaw and cheeks. The once perfect features that had captivated Proust and Rodin were gradually transformed into what observers would later describe as a terrifying apparition that bore no resemblance to her former glory. But Gladys had spent too many years plotting the ultimate social conquest to let a little facial disfigurement stop her from claiming the greatest prize in the British aristocratic marriage market. For 15 years, Gladys had been conducting the most patient and ruthless romantic campaign in European high society, and she wasn't about to let melting paraffin wax derail her pursuit of a duke. This obsession had begun when she was just 14 years old and read about the Duke's 1895 marriage to American heiress Consuelo Vanderbilt, prompting her to write in her diary, "Oh dear, if only I was a little older I might catch him yet." Her strategy was both patient and ruthless. She befriended Consuelo Vanderbilt and became a regular guest at Blenheim Palace, where she could observe the unhappy marriage firsthand and position herself as the perfect alternative. The Duke's marriage to Consuelo had been a typical Gilded Age transaction. He needed the Vanderbilt millions to restore Blenheim Palace, while her mother wanted her daughter to become a duchess, and neither was in love with the other. Gladys's friendship with the miserable Consuelo provided her with intimate access to the Duke's world and allowed her to present herself as everything his wife was not: intellectually stimulating, romantically available, and genuinely interested in him as a person. By 1912, Gladys had successfully become the Duke's mistress, beginning an affair that would last nearly 20 years and essentially make her the unofficial mistress of Blenheim Palace. The relationship was conducted with the kind of aristocratic openness that was common in elite circles, where extramarital affairs were tolerated as long as they were handled with proper discretion and style. After years of legal manoeuvring, the Duke and Consuelo were finally granted a divorce in 1921, clearing the path for Gladys to achieve her ultimate ambition. On June 25, 1921, at the age of 40, but claiming to be 35 on the marriage certificate, Gladys finally married Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in a ceremony in Paris. She wore a gown of gold tissue specially woven in Italy, with a veil that strategically concealed her increasingly disfigured features, while the marriage made international headlines. However, the reality of married life at Blenheim Palace proved to be nothing like the fairy tale Gladys had imagined during her 15-year pursuit of the Duke. The couple were fundamentally incompatible in temperament and interests, and the Duke was increasingly repelled by his wife's deteriorating appearance and increasingly erratic behaviour. Gladys's conduct became progressively more disturbing and unpredictable, including making shocking comments at social gatherings and once placing a revolver on the dinner table while threatening to shoot her husband. She kept a revolver in her bedroom to prevent the Duke from entering, and her paranoia and eccentric behaviour made her an impossible companion for a man who valued aristocratic dignity above all else. One of the most damaging aspects of Gladys's tenure as Duchess was her obsession with breeding Blenheim spaniels, which she allowed to overrun the palace and cause extensive damage to the recently restored interiors. The dogs ruined carpets, furniture, and priceless artwork, much to the Duke's horror, while Gladys seemed to prefer their company to that of humans. Winston Churchill, the Duke's cousin and frequent visitor, initially found her intriguing, but eventually became bored and irritated by her company, describing her social circle as strange, glittering beings with whom I have little or nothing in common. By the early 1930s, the Duke had reached the absolute limit of his patience with his wife's behaviour and began planning the most humiliating end to a fairy tale marriage in aristocratic history. What happened next would transform the Duchess of Marlborough from palace royalty into a reclusive madwoman who would die forgotten and alone in a mental institution. The fairy tale that had taken Gladys 15 years to orchestrate was about to end with the kind of spectacular public humiliation that makes modern celebrity divorces look civilized by comparison. He moved out first, leaving Gladys alone in the vast mansion with her pack of unruly spaniels, but eventually returned with legal authority to force her complete removal from the premises. The eviction was carried out with ruthless efficiency, and Gladys was forced to leave behind most of her possessions as she was banished from the palace that had been her home for over a decade. The only permanent reminders of her time at Blenheim Palace were the 2 Sphinx sculptures bearing her features on the West Terraces and the mysterious giant blue eyes she had commissioned to be painted on the portico ceiling. The Duke of Marlborough died in 1934, just 1 year after evicting his wife, leaving Gladys as the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough, but with no intention of ever returning to public life. Instead, she began the long retreat from society that would characterise the final 4 decades of her life, moving to a farm at Chacombe in Oxfordshire, where she lived under the assumed name Mrs. Spencer. At Chacombe, Gladys transformed into a complete recluse, living in increasingly squalid conditions, surrounded by her beloved dogs and the few possessions she had managed to salvage from her aristocratic past. She became a local curiosity, known for dressing eccentrically in a boiler suit cinched with sacking, an old straw hat, and Wellington boots studded with red puncture repair patches that made her look like a deranged scarecrow. Local children, convinced she was a witch, would throw stones at her house and taunt her, prompting Gladys to retaliate by confronting them with a shotgun, though she claimed it was unloaded. Her behaviour became increasingly erratic and paranoid as she would telephone strangers in the middle of the night or wander her property at odd hours, creating genuine concerns about her mental stability. The transformation from celebrated duchess to isolated eccentric was so complete that when Conservative MP Henry Chips Channon encountered her in a Bond Street jewellery shop in 1943, he barely recognised the grotesque figure before him. Channon described seeing an extraordinary marionette of a woman, or was it a man, wearing grey flannel trousers, a wide leather belt, masculine overcoat, and a man's brown felt hat, and had a really frightening appearance. When Channon attempted to introduce himself, Gladys looked at him with vacant eyes and muttered, "Je n'ai jamais entendu ce nom-là," before fleeing the shop in terror, completely denying her own identity. By 1962, Gladys's behaviour had become so erratic and potentially dangerous that authorities could no longer ignore her deteriorating condition and the risk she posed to herself and others. At age 81, she was forcibly committed to St Andrew's Hospital in Northampton, a psychiatric facility where she would spend the final 15 years of her life in the psycho-geriatric ward. Despite her confinement, Gladys retained much of her intellectual capacity and continued to read voraciously, though she was clearly aware of her circumstances and the dramatic fall from her former glory. During her years at St Andrew's Hospital, young Hugo Vickers discovered her existence and became her only regular visitor, visiting her 65 times over 2 years before her death. When Vickers asked her, "Where is Gladys Deacon?" she replied slowly and sadly, "Gladys Deacon?" She never existed, essentially erasing her own identity and legacy. On October 13th, 1977, at the age of 96, Gladys Deacon died alone in St Andrew's Hospital, marking the end of one of the most extraordinary and tragic lives of the 20th century. Her life embodies the cruel paradox of the Gilded Age, where unprecedented wealth and social mobility coexisted with rigid beauty standards and limited options for even the most privileged women. Her story reveals how the era's obsession with classical perfection and aristocratic status could corrupt even the most intelligent minds, turning natural gifts into sources of self-destruction. In pursuing an impossible ideal of beauty and social position, she represents countless women who sacrificed authentic happiness for society's shallow definitions of success. Perhaps most haunting is how Gladys's final denial of her own existence, she never existed, reflected a deeper truth about the emptiness of a life built entirely on external validation. Her transformation from celebrated muse to forgotten patient illustrates the ultimate futility of defining oneself through others' admiration, whether from artists, aristocrats, or society at large. The sphinxes at Blenheim Palace may preserve her features in stone, but they also serve as monuments to the danger of mistaking appearance for identity, beauty for worth, and conquest for love. With that said, we'd love to see you in the comments. Were you familiar with Gladys Deacon's tragic ending, or is this your first time hearing about this? We look forward to hearing your thoughts, and with that said, thanks for joining another episode of Old Money Allure.